go. Yo, that's Ice Glide from Rooks G. And that one fits. That's a great one because tomorrow night we're going to be doing True Detective with our friend Maddie. So it fits that we've got Ice Glide. How's the volume? How we doing? Settings always got to be changed with this thing every time, especially with, well, whatever. But anyway, let me know if volume's all right, if I'm coming in too hot. Tonight we're covering Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cat's Cradle and also Mother Night. And Mother Night, I'm going to be focusing on on the film Mother Night with Nick Nolte, which is not bad. It's not a bad film. And then Cat's Cradle, I'll be talking about sort of in an ancillary sense, but mainly I'm going to focus on Slaughterhouse 5. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate you out there. And listen, I'm going to take these headphones off. We got a big one. We got a big one tonight and tomorrow night because we're getting really close. We're 5 away from 3K. So if you're watching out there and you haven't subscribed, please hit that subscribe button so we can get that 3K because we got a big party that we're going to be coming in hot this coming weekend. And hopefully we're going to have some special guests. Got some special guests lined up. So we're going to be coming in hot. And I don't know what we're going to cover, but I plan on, in honor of Carl Weathers, we've only just begun to live white lace and promises. A kiss for luck and we're on our way. We're going to be doing Predator. I'm thinking Predator and Point Break. I've been wanting to do Point Break for a long time. It's my favorite movie. Well, besides Apocalypse Now, but we've done that a bunch of times. We recently did Heart of Darkness. So we'll be doing Point Break, Predator, and we got some special guests lined up. So please help me with that 3K, you guys. And you're already here, so I really appreciate y'all. Listen, tonight we're doing Kurt Vonnegut's mainly focusing on Slaughterhouse 5. And this one is special thank you to our friend out there, our generous friend, Dr. Head. Appreciate you, sir. Thank you, sir, Mr. Dr. Head out there who sponsored this one. Hey, Kurt Vonnegut stream. And I'm going to do Slaughterhouse 5 because that's really the main Vonnegut. Now, people out there, I hope you take my analysis here with, as it comes, right? My method's unsound. I don't see any method here at all, sir. Because, Jethro, I'll discuss my personal thoughts on Kurt Vonnegut as we go. But let me just say, when we're doing a literary analysis, a deep dive explication, a total breakdown of works, it's not necessary that you like the or don't like the author, right? Now that will play into it, but we can hold two competing ideas in our mind, and yet be dispassionate and objective about it. Of course, I'm going to probably cross the line with that as we go, but I do think, starting out, that Kurt Vonnegut is firmly in the canon. He is. And scholars have sort of gone back and forth over this. But Harold Bloom, for one, and we talk a lot about Harold Bloom here and the invention of the human in the Western canon. Harold Bloom, for one, said that Kurt Vonnegut's early novels were necessary and necessarily part of the canon. So we're going to go with that as one of our angles of looking into this. And I do think it's necessary. I do think it's necessary. Did I glitch? I don't think I glitched. Hopefully I'm all right. I do think it's necessary to read Kurt Vonnegut, but somewhere along the line, he sort of crosses into something else, and I'm going to talk about what that means. But I think that Kurt Vonnegut, if anything, fits firmly into the postmodern canon. And we've talked here about modernism, modernity, postmodernism, postmodernism, and now postmodernism with our current era, until that has a name. But this is the sort of artistic era that began in 2020, which I think is a whole new era. I don't think that's a hot take. I think it is what it is. But Vonnegut is interesting because, in a way, for one, he writes, obviously he writes in a satirical sense with sort of terse, plain sentences. And I appreciate his grasp of language, especially when it comes to this book and the discussion of a kind of what others call PTSD. I'm going to call it a sort of a DID in this book because of the dissociation of the speaker into Billy Pilgrim. Now, that is interesting because it's a framed novel, and we just covered Heart of Darkness, which is another framed novella. But this one is a little weird. I mean, it is weird, but it's supposed to be purposefully weird. What we have, I'll just dive into Slaughterhouse 5 here. What we have here is a framed novel where we have a speaker at the beginning who I guess most would say is the voice of Kurt Vonnegut. Kurt Vonnegut was in the bombing of Dresden, and I think it's, again, necessary that we cover this. This is the way that our prerequisites work, because the 79th anniversary of Dresden is coming up in a couple weeks. So it's apt that we cover this. And it's also, I think, important to cover this because I read an interview from another writer who was he was a soldier. He was a British soldier involved. He was there in Dresden when the bombing took place, when the firebombing took place. And one of the things that he said in the article was, in the interview, was that he'd been working on a novel about Dresden for years, but that Vonnegut really got the truth of the circumstances of this. And I think this is where literature is important, and where this book is really important, because we can talk about factual accounts and a sort of objective historical analysis of the bombing, but it's also important to understand a kind of a subjective firsthand witnessing of it, of the events and how they take place in a kind of truth that transcends factual occurrences. And what I mean by that is, in a way, Slaughterhouse 5 reminds me of a bunch of works that we've covered so far, including The Great Gatsby of all things, right? The story of Jeff Stein McCaffrey, but it's the Valley of Ashes. We cover the Valley of Ashes. It literally becomes a Valley of Ashes. T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Now that's modernity, and that's the height of the culmination of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, Dresden occurs just before the A-bomb. And so the A-bomb, of course, marks the beginning of the postmodern period. We have a clear division in terms of artistic eras and the artistic looking into these things. Yeah, Toadmaster says back to school is embarrassing. Well, it's crazy you bring that up because, yeah, if you guys don't remember, that's, Kurt Vonnegut was in Back to School. Hey, it must have been something before electricity. That's Caddyshack. We've done Caddyshack. But he was in Back to School. And somebody else mentioned in the chat before we started that I think it was Token, you mentioned that you'd met him in Cape Cod at like a Saab dealership. I think it was you. And I've found it amazing how many people I've come across who met Kurt Vonnegut in person. He got around. I mean, he did a lot of speaking. He did a lot of college tours. I know a lady that was at University of Virginia when he came to do a seminar on creative writing, and was very popular. And he's one of these guys he's in a way he's a little bit of like the Stan Lee of the literary world, and this is different, of course, from Dylan Thomas. Authors and poets will make their money by doing speaking tours. I've met Yusef Komunyakaa twice. I mean, he's, in my opinion, the greatest living poet. But Dylan Thomas and his there's a book called Dylan Thomas in America. I think it's Constantine Fitzgibbon wrote that one, I think. We covered Dylan Thomas. But, of course, he did speaking tours. I told you the story about when he had to do he was doing a reading at a university, and he stopped at every pub along the way and was an hour late. It was packed. And when it came time for him to speak, he went up to the podium and threw up on the front, on the first row of the audience. And they said, "Wow, what a genius. What a rock star." Of course, that was before rock stars, but authors and poets will do this. Of course, Kurt Vonnegut was successful in his lifetime because this is unusual, for an artist kind of on the fringes between the avant-garde and the mainstream. Right, he's sort of right in the middle. That his books I don't think any of his books are out of print. They continue to be printed. That's highly unusual. So that provided him a living. I watched one of his Charlie Rose interviews, and he talked about how he got a $3,000 advance, I think, for Cat's Cradle. And at the time, that would be huge now, for any writer. It doesn't sound like a lot, but we all know it would be. But any advance, is important. But yeah, he I don't think that well, I'll get into Vonnegut and what I think of him as a writer. All those are pluses. But it is interesting that his writing is his books are sort of right in the middle. And I think here's my take. Okay. I think this is because Kurt Vonnegut, it's not really a hot take, but I think Kurt Vonnegut writes, and I just read this other guy put it best, I'm just going to take it. He said, Kurt Vonnegut writes children's stories for adults. And I don't mean that as a slam. What I mean is that his writing is simplistic, purposefully simplistic in a postmodernist way that differs from Ernest Hemingway. And of course, Ernest Hemingway, has kind of athletic sentences. And we've covered in our time, I think, A Farewell to Arms, we did The Sun Also Rises. And he takes this sort of American Twainian, Hemingwayan tradition of almost a journalistic, simple writing style, which really serves his prose in a great way, in a maximum effect, because that belies the complexity of his narratives. However, there comes a point where the absurdism, to me, I'll just say this, the absurdism in Vonnegut's writing, to me, gets to be too much in the sense that uh, I think that when a writer is clearly focused, just without any criticism, just any exterior criticism, but just focusing on the words themselves. When a writer's narratives are focused so clearly on humanism, okay, and what I mean is a kind of anti-metaphysical postmodern humanism, it 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 tends to drop the bottom out of any of the deep and meaningful connections that we can make to the truth of the work. And Edward says, "Yo, shouts out for that $5 super chat. Thank you." Gets that I get Vonnegut to write his. I thought you meant me. You talking about Rodney, right? I thought you spelled my name wrong. Rodney. Rodney, yes, gets Vonnegut to write his paper, and Sally Kellerman says, "Whoever wrote this doesn't know the first thing about Kurt Vonnegut." Yes, and then Kurt Vonnegut, of course, wrote the paper. Yes, thank you for bringing that up, which is very funny, and is a kind of a Vonnegut. That's a tongue-in-cheek Vonnegut way of looking at academia, and is absolutely true. You know, again, not factual. We're watching a comedy, but a lot of times with Vonnegut, I don't find his prose funny, and I find it absurd in a humorous way. But I start to lose my sense of humor when I see that all of this is for naught. Okay, if that makes sense. And here's what I mean. Don't come at me, bro. I think that people should read this. I think that it's necessary. I think it's part of the canon. We don't have to like everything that we read, of course. And we only sort of discover that through the process of reading. So, but I think that one of the things about Slaughterhouse 5, and especially with Cat's Cradle, is that we get a broken world that's clearly broken. It's an exterior symbol of the speaker's interior state. And especially in Slaughterhouse 5, where Billy Pilgrim is a time traveler. So here he's okay. All right. So let me try and break this down. All right. So we start off with the speaker, and he talks about how he was in Dresden, and he is, he has this work. And then we get Billy Pilgrim is the protagonist of the story, and Billy Pilgrim comes from Schenectady, New York, right? Which we would only have gotten if we had just done, we just did The Place Beyond the Pines, which is a purely Schenectady set movie, which is very interesting. How synchro, bro, that movie connects to the next work that we just out of the universe, and that's part of the postmodern sort of connection. Which is one of the ironic things about reading postmodern works, that there is a weird connection amongst individuals, but there's a lack of connection to the universe, and it's seen as like proto-nihilistic in its apogee, I guess. So that's very strange. But so we get Billy Pilgrim, who comes from Schenectady, and he then finds himself. The narrative is nonlinear, and so he finds himself in. I'm simplifying here, but he finds himself in Dresden. He's in the army. First, he's in a couple battles, and there's this guy that he tags along with, who's a vicious kind of psychopath character. He walks. He loses his boots. He is forced to walk. He's captured by the Germans. The Germans are going by, and they're going to the front. And I'll talk about that in a second. And how they're portrayed in the book. And they're going to the front, and then he's taken prisoner of war off to Dresden, Germany. And Dresden is a city that was not heavily defended, but was seen by the Allied side, especially Churchill, as a legitimate target. And Churchill eventually, one of the reasons was that it was bombed was Churchill saw it as a legitimate payback for the bombing of Coventry. But the numbers of dead in Dresden go anywhere from like 15,000 to 125,000 people. That's actually in the book. He mentions that. He mentions a very controversial figure that he quotes in the book that I don't even want to bring it up, but it's a guy's name that Norm talked about and that Maddie and I have talked about. David something. But anyway, he the numbers are crazy, and the way he discusses the bombing is crazy. But he's basically he finds shelter where he's being imprisoned in a slaughterhouse, and the slaughterhouse is called Number 5. And then when he walks out, it's this kind of black rain scenario where he walks out and you turn the rain black. Except here, it's you turn the rain into fire, and from there he goes on and he finds himself in a mental hospital, and he then meets these outer space aliens, these fake and grays, who are like plungers with eyeballs in their hands. So we get a kind of remember Jamie and I covered Labyrinth, the movie Labyrinth, and this is weird, but there's a strange tie-in because he is in a labyrinth of his own mind, lost in dissociation here, and so of course he goes to this planet called Tralfamador, and they describe what time is like. Now, another thing that this ties into is when he meets the aliens, they are kind of like blob creatures, like in the movie Arrival, which is interesting because in Arrival, the Denis Villeneuve movie, remember the aliens come from the future, but time is a flat circle. Time is a kind of flat circle. And it also reminds me of William Butler Yeats's Turning and Turning in the Widening Gyre. We get the sense that time is a kind of repeating cyclical cycle of eons and gyres, which leads us to think in metaphysical terms here about time and about the meaning of life. But the speaker does not think about it that way, and in fact ends up with conflicting views of the nature of religion and our purpose here on earth. And this actually is interesting because I've talked a lot over the course of these streams, over the course of 2 years, we're almost at 2 years now, about how all art, especially literature, seems to be about, or is about, two things. And one is why are we here, right? Our relationship with God. And the second is, what are we supposed to do, our relationship with each other, right? What are we supposed to do while we're here? That's what all writing eventually becomes about. And this is a great example of this because even though there's a kind of emptiness and a weird, postmodern, broken, fragmented, dissociated cloud of nothingness in the book, a lot of the book and the most significant passages in the book are focused on that very thing, on the speaker's questioning of why is he here, why has this happened, and what's our relationship with God. So even in the absence of those, it becomes about those things. And I think that KF says, yeah, that's why we read. Well, I think that, again, poetry, when we read poetry, this is the best example of this because we have the best words in the best order. And it fits that the book is a prose work, that it's a novel, because it's the kind of words thrown on the page in a hodgepodge as if it's reflecting form and content or reflecting the way that time works. Right. You like my hand tattoo? I have a hand tattoo. And I do. So I think that, the book is fascinating in that sense. Cat's Cradle, although it precedes this book, does it precede it? Yeah. Cat's Cradle precedes this book. Yeah. Cat's Cradle is another example of this, but it also is like a satire on religion in a way with the Baconans, and the sort of cult that arises in a third world sort of globalist island with Ice Nine. But here's my problem, though. One of the things that, okay, so I'll put it this way. One of the things that I've mentioned before about the importance of reading, let's just call it that, is it doesn't necessarily matter if you read a book and you like the book, as long as you can take just one word out of the book that is meaningful both outside of you and in the sense that it means something to you in your soul. And The one phrase that I took out of Cat's Cradle was Ice Nine. It's an evocative term that he creates. I think it's brilliant. It's funny, and it's kind of satirical of military-industrial complex, DARPA-esque shenanigans, and it's also lyrical. Um, but I think that in general, my problem with Kurt Vonnegut, just personally speaking, is that unlike other, let's say, postmodern writers like Delillo or Cormac McCarthy, um, the important thing for me personally is that the books show that they're in love with language, right? Why would you be a writer if you're not in love with language? And to me, although Vonnegut is clearly a master of language as a writer, I don't get the visceral sort of excitement from Vonnegut novels that others do. And I realize that others get those books, that they get these works and they love them. A lot of people have mentioned how, Slaughterhouse 5 was their favorite book when they were younger, and I get that. I understand that. I don't think that. But it's also kind of an unfair comparison because these are like different worlds. I mean, Cormac McCarthy's world is completely different from the world of White Noise, but they still have a sort of a connection in this like weird alienation that we see where the characters and the speakers in the books are within this like electrified landscape. Cat's Cradle and Slaughterhouse 5 don't do that. At least not to me. They're not the same worlds, and that's fine. That the writers have completely different universes in terms of their language. But like, for example, we're doing Maddie and I are doing the True Detective stream tomorrow night on Night Country, and of course, I won't say much about it, but one of the scenes in episode 1 is they find a copy of Blood Meridian that one of the guys was reading before they ran out on the ice, and I found that True Detective is a kind of like overtly, especially season 1, is an overtly Cormac McCarthyan world. I mean, it's phantasmagorical, so it makes sense that that's in there. Also, that'll play into some of my like theories about what's happening in season 4. But I opened up Blood Meridian last night, and I just opened it to a random page, and I found a passage that clearly fits. It evokes more about True Detective than anything else that I could say or that I've read. Okay, so now the opposite of that is, I'm reading Blood, I'm talking about Blood Meridian, I'm talking about True Detective, and those are two very specific things. But those are relevant for now. They give us an insight into the way the world is now. They give us a kind of transcendent truth about a specific sort of paradigm way of thinking about the world and worldview. But I can't get that from Vonnegut. I can't open up a Vonnegut book to a random page and love the language. Now that's my own thing, and so that's not necessarily a takeaway, but I do see that as a kind of takeaway, and a kind of negative point with Kurt Vonnegut's work. So before I say any more about that, let me give you some textual evidence to back up what I'm saying here, and let's go through a little bit of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, which copyright 1966 and then 1968. I know that he published it right after the big RFK event. And here's his epigraph to the book. The cattle are lowing, the baby awakes, but the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. And so we have an epigraph that is supposed to inform our narrative here. And so that sort of is evidence of what I was just saying. I think that perfectly supports what I was just saying about the meaning of literary work and how we look into literary work. Okay, so here's chapter 1, because this is the framed chapter. The chapter 1 and the final chapter, to me, are the best chapters in the book. Best is kind of a nebulous word to use there, but I'll show you what I mean here. So he begins, all this happened, more or less. Great first sentence. Great first sentence because this is a first sentence. This is an opening sentence that is in the Melville tradition, right? Or in the strong American first sentence tradition of a great American novel. We have something that is complete, total, crystalline, pure. No, we have something that is complete and total. It's short, it's terse, right? And it's a statement on the past, but it also contradicts itself slightly, right? All this happened more or less. Well, did it happen or didn't it? Well, that's what we're going to read into the novel. It's not magical realism, and it's not it's not phantasmagorical. It's a great word. I love that word. I learned that from reading Poe and Hawthorne when I was in like 10th grade, about 10th grade. I love that word. I love the. There's even a record label that I like by Errol Alkin has a record label called Fantasy Sound, PHANTASY, Fantasy Sound. In England that I like just because of that word, but I also like the music. But all this happened more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I know really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war, and so on. I've changed all the names. I really did go back to Dresden with Guggenheim money. God love it, in 1967. It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio, more open spaces than Dayton has. There must be tons of human bone meal in the ground. Now, that's McCarthy. I'm not going to compare this to Cormac McCarthy the entire way, but that is a fairly postmodern wasteland type of, opening two paragraphs here, right? Because we've already got the Valley of Ashes and the wasteland, and now we've got the instance of a kind of soil infused with human bone meat. I went back there. There was an old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare, and we made friends with a cab driver who took us to the Slaughterhouse house where we'd been locked up at night as prisoners of war. His name was Gerhard Mueller. He told us that he was a prisoner of the Americans for a while. We asked him how it was to live under communism. He said that it was terrible at first because everybody had to work so hard and because there wasn't much shelter, food, or clothing, but things were much better now. He had a pleasant little apartment, and his daughter was getting an excellent education. His mother was incinerated in the Dresden firestorm. So it goes. Okay, so do you see how the opening of the story becomes a kind of fantasy fairy tale mixed in with a children's story for adults, mixed in with the like the human bone is mixed in with the soil here, and the dark events like being incinerated in Dresden are mixed in with the matter-of-fact happenstance perspective that we take on this terrible occasion at the very beginning of the book. Right? And so it goes is interesting because c'est la vie. This is the recurring phrase, the recurring repetitive phrase. It functions as a kind of refrain in the song of the book. And this is what the Tralfamadorians teach Billy Pilgrim about life, that there is no meaning, that they say that when people die, they're not really dead, and so you see them again, and then you haven't. So time becomes a big glob. And I think, the ambiguity of this, the interesting thing is that I can see, especially younger readers, taking a kind of false consolation and hope in this kind of statement that nobody is ever really dead. But that's not what he means here. He doesn't mean it as a kind of he doesn't mean it as a significant and whole religious soul statement. He means it as a kind of disassociative Blavatsky watchers told him that time is a flat circle and infinite, and that there's a sentence in here where he says something about how at the time they were teaching in anthropology that there was no difference between human beings. And I found that one of the most important phrases in the book, or sentences in the book, because it shows that the speaker doesn't really tell his feelings about this, but it does seem to be a kind of, yes, Kit, you're right. It's a kind of flippant fatalism where there doesn't need to necessarily be a judgment on the thing that he offered in the past, because we already understand that every human being is unique. And if they aren't, then what's the purpose of writing the book from your own perspective, right? Is it just I feel the need to write this down, here's some feelings? Well, what's the point of feelings if everything is enumerated and numericized? That's not a word, but put into the numbers of a kind of scientific, viewpoint, right? And yes, Token, you bring up a good point. This is a great example of the unreliable narrator. He starts off from the very beginning being unreliable. And so we question whether we can read the book as actually a sci-fi fantasy meeting these Tralfamadorians and going into outer space and going through these time jumps where he becomes unstuck in time, as he says. Or if it's supposed to be ironic and then figurative, or both, or neither. And the way I kind of read it, and that I really find myself thinking about Kurt Vonnegut, is I think that part of his continuous voice, because his voice his voice recurs throughout his novels. We get recurring characters in a kind of a Vonnegut universe here. What we see here is that he means it to be literal at first, like he becomes unstuck in time. He's a time traveler. He goes into outer space. He meets these guys. Then, as we go along in time, ironically, we have a kind of meta-ironic fold over where we're looking at things figuratively, and this is supposed to be metaphorical. But then I sort of end up thinking that neither is true, and that it's just a kind of dissociative fantasy in the mind of a speaker who's lost control and lost a handle on what life and time are. Right? Because it's fine to think about things in a non-linear sense. Like, just take a famous example of a non-linear narrative, like, Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction immediately comes to mind. But the form and the content work together in that because we have competing narratives and viewpoints of a single story. In this one, we have all competing viewpoints, but from one person's perspective, which clearly shows brokenness, right? This is the exterior broken landscape of postmodernity that melds into something that is meaningless. And I understand why a person, I can't understand in a bodily, physical, first-person sense what it would be like to go through Dresden, of course, because we're here and he's there, and and the speaker goes through that. But I can do the best I can with what he's given me in the book, so I can understand why he thinks that, but I don't agree, if that makes sense. So I know that's a lot of words. I'm just saying a lot of words, you guys. But he says. So when he continues to have this refrain, right, of "so it goes," he's saying that, it is what it is. Isn't that predictive for now? Isn't that the kind of status quo thinking of now with a lot of people? Not with me, but with a lot of people, right? Token says, I've never even tried a Red Bull, as the people here know. Man, love me some Red Bull. You guys can help me get more Red Bull. No, you can help me to get more books that we need to cover by supporting me through the links that our beautiful, wonderful mods are dropping in the chat or going to the video description. And you can support me that way. And you can also make sure, if you haven't subscribed, especially if you're watching this later, that you subscribe so that you can help me get to 3,000 subs, because we're going to have this party next weekend. He says, I like that very. He says, I wish you and your family also, as to your friend, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I hope that we'll meet again in a world of peace and freedom in the taxi cab, if the accident will. I like that very much, if the accident will. I would hate to tell you what this lousy little book cost me in money and anxiety and time. When I got home from the Second World War 23 years ago, I thought it would be easy for me to write about the destruction of Dresden, since all it would have to do would be to report what I'd seen. And I thought, too, that it would be a masterpiece, or at least make me a lot of money, since the subject was so big. And I understand what he's saying here. He's saying that we can read about the destruction of Dresden from a kind of objective journalistic viewpoint of facts and events, or even read about it in a William Shirer way of, historical data, and we're looking at time and we're trying to connect the reasons for such things. But when we start to question the reasons for things, now we're going into the abstract and then in the metaphysical. And human beings think in words, right? We think in words and ideas. Now, great literature, as Carlos Williams said, great literature is made of words, but the words are imbued with ideas and with thoughts and feelings, and we all have those. So it's important to understand that he's going to attempt these things, but he, again, sort of functions on the fringes of both. He says, and I thought, too, that it would be a masterpiece, or at least make me a lot of money, since the subject was so big, but not many words about Dresden came from my mind then, not enough of them to make a book my way. And not many words come now either, when I've become old, with his memories and Pall Malls, and with his sons full grown. I think how useless the Dresden part of my memory has been, and yet how tempting Dresden has been to write about. And I'm reminded of the famous limerick. Then he goes, he's constantly repeating these limericks. And the limericks, I get the limericks. They annoy me in the book because I get it. It's an edgy take, and it becomes absurdist to try and put into words an event that nobody else can experience. Remember, Heart of Darkness did this so well without the limericks. But he says, and so on to infinity. And then there's this part, he says, over the years, people I've met have often asked what I'm working on, and I've usually replied that the main thing was a book about Dresden. I said that to Harrison Starr, the movie maker, one time, and he raised his eyebrows and inquired, is it an anti-war book? Yes, I said, I guess. You know what I say to people when I hear they're writing anti-war books? No, what do you say, Harrison Starr? I say, why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead? What he meant, of course, was that there would always be wars and that they were as easy to stop as glaciers. I believe that, too. And so that is a great phrase. And then he talks about the work. He says, I had the Bell Telephone Company find this guy, Bernard, for me. They're wonderful that way. I had this disease late at night sometimes involving alcohol at the telephone. I get drunk and I drive my wife away with a breath like mustard gas and roses, and then speaking gravely and elegantly into the telephone, I ask the telephone operators to connect me with his friend or that one from whom I have not heard in years. I got O'Hare on the line in this way. He's short and I'm tall. We were Mutt and Jeff in the war. We were captured together in the war. I told him who I was on the telephone. He had no trouble believing it. He was up. He was reading. Everybody else in this house was asleep. Listen, I said, I'm writing this book about Dresden. I'd like some help remembering stuff. I wonder if I could come down and see you and we could drink and talk together. He was unenthusiastic. He said he couldn't remember much. He told me, though, to come ahead. I think the climax of the book will be the execution of poor old Edgar Darby. The irony is so great. The whole city gets burned down and thousands of people are killed. And then this one American foot soldier is arrested in the ruins for taking a teapot. And he's given a regular trial and then he's shot by firing squad. Said O'Hare. Don't you think that's really where the climax should come? I don't know anything about it. That's your trade, not mine. And I understand the alienation that he feels, even when trying to, connect with this other guy that can talk about the events. But even this other guy, even his friend, can't connect with him about the things that they've gone through. And this is also a great example of postmodern irony, right? What he just described, the situation he just described. He describes finding a ceremonial Luftwaffe saber in a pole as he's being taken away. And then how later he went to University of Chicago, Rockefeller School. At that time, they were teaching there was absolutely no difference between anybody. Fits that they would be talking about that. Anything they taught was that nobody, another thing they taught was that nobody was ridiculous or bad or disgusting. Shortly before my father died, he said to me, you never wrote a story with a villain in it. I told him that was one of the things I learned in college after the war, that there are no villains. And then he says on page 10 of this book, not many Americans knew how much worse it had been than Hiroshima, for instance. I didn't know that either. There hadn't been much publicity. World War II had certainly made everybody tough. And he talks about Schenectady here, which is where I connected this with Place Beyond the Pines. And then he says on page 11, I wrote the Air Force back then asking for details about the raid on Dresden, who ordered it, how many planes did it, why they did it, with what desirable results there had been, and so on. I was answered by a man who, like myself, was in public relations. He said he was sorry, but that the information was top secret still. I read the letter out loud to my wife, and I said, secret, my God, from whom? And this is one of the alienating aspects of the book, which I think is really important to read, because this conflagration takes place where people are incinerated and boiled in their skin. And there's nothing left. And it's just it's a complete valley of ashes and burning tarmac. And he was there, and yet no one seems to know anything about it, because it's taken over by another series of events that even those two events mark the artistic eras and eons, right? We just talked about that. And yet this one seems to be much more personal. And that was part of the point. I won't get into a historical analysis of Dresden, but that was clearly part of the point of this happening, which for the speaker here obviously makes him ironically lose his faith in humanity and also only have faith in human beings and nothing else, which is weird. He goes on to say here, let's see, page 15, he says, so then I understood. It was war that made her so angry. She didn't want her babies or anybody else's babies killed in war, and she thought wars were partly encouraged by books and movies. So here we get a kind of Blakean innocence versus experience. And this is important because one of the things that Vonnegut does in the book really well is he describes the Germans when they are captured and what they look like. And this is, I found this part, a small part in the book, but probably one of the most fascinating things, because he talks about how a war photographer comes up to him and takes a picture of him with no shoes on, because they're going to use it for propaganda to say, oh, look how the Americans prepare their own soldiers for this war, right? Which would probably be effective, but he describes the Germans, I'll find the passage in a minute, but he describes them in a really, not a humanist way, but in a human way, where they are human beings. And that makes you, obviously we question why these things have to exist. But we live in a fallen world, and I don't mean to say, oh, such is life, like he does. And I don't mean to say that, wars will always happen. There will be an end to war. There will be plenty of wars. Remember, Christ says there will be plenty of, there will be wars, right? Nation will rise against nation, brother against brother. We don't know the time or the place, but we can expect those things to continue, unfortunately, right? And that's because we are fallible. And yet, there's a kind of lack of that in the book. There's just a kind of a token alienation, emotional alienation when it comes to those things. And I understand why he does that in terms of the content of the book. But I find it to be, I don't want to say negative or nihilistic, because that's sort of the point of the book, obviously. But I find it to be almost disingenuous. He's searching time and space for meaning, but in the wrong places, right? He's looking for love in all the wrong places. And I'm not saying that every book has to be uplifting. It doesn't. And I think people should read this book, but maybe they should read the book for the absence of those things, if that makes sense, right? I circled the word. This is what I'm talking about. I just finished. I put it off, and then I finally this weekend I tore through this book in one day. The High Wind in Jamaica, which one of our friends had put down as a sponsor stream a long time ago. And then I covered a different book on his list. But I read Richard Hughes's High Wind in Jamaica, and I just circled the word cockles because it was one of the words that stood out to me in that book. Again, this book, the phrase that stuck out to me in this book, High Wind in Jamaica, is mists of myth. It's a beautiful phrase. That's one of the things that I will remember from that book, The Mists of Myth. You got to find words that you grab onto that seem to explain meaning for you. But he talks about the cockles of Billy's heart, at any rate, were glowing coals. What made them so hot was Billy's belief that he was going to comfort so many people with the truth about time. His door chimes upstairs had been ringing and ringing. It was his daughter Barbara up there wanting in. Now she let herself in with the key, crossed the floor over his head, calling, "Father, Daddy, where are you?" and so on. Billy didn't answer her, so she was nearly hysterical, expecting to find his corpse. And then she looked into the very last place there was to look, which was the rumpus room. "Why didn't you answer me when I called?" She had the afternoon paper with her, the one in which Billy described his friends from Tralfamadore. "I didn't hear you." And he goes on to experience, again, an alienated relationship with his daughter. But one of the phrases that I took from this is on page 43, where he says, Billy Pilgrim had stopped in the forest. He was leaning against a tree with his eyes closed. His head was tilted back and his nostrils were flaring. He was like a poet in the Parthenon. Great sentence. Great example of showing instead of telling, right? He's showing us an image which that's going to play into one of the next analyses that I'm doing, which is Shakespeare's Coriolanus, because there's a lack of lyricism in that play. It's the final historical tragedy, not a traditional Shakespearean tragedy, but it's one of the final historical tragedies. And there's a lack of lyricism because everything is all action in the play. And we get characters who look like living, breathing bronze busts of Roman patricians, if that makes sense. And I thought this was a great phrase that's weirdly tied into that. This was when Billy had first came unstuck in time. His attention began to swing grandly through the full arc of his life, passing into death, which was violet light. There wasn't anybody else there or anything. There was just violet light and a hum. And so my take on the Tralfamadorians is that they kind of function as a quasi-clockwork elves, right? He sees the clockwork elves and the watchers and sees that time is a kind of nebulous Oort cloud where nothing matters and there's no meaning. And it's not Gnostic. He's not trying to break through the prison planet to the other side into, illumination. Instead, he just finds that there's just a kind of biological nothingness. And in fact, the reason I say that is because he says at one point that the Tralfamadorians are more interested in the Darwinian theory, the Darwinian paradigm, than they are in the religious paradigm of what humans have done on Earth. And so that informs his, the clockwork elves told him so. That informs his kind of weird social Darwinistic yet humanistic paradigm of the world. Does that make sense? I hope so. I know it's a lot of words again. He says, let's see. There's a great phrase here. Yeah, okay, I love this part. Page 72, chapter 4, he says, Billy got out of bed in the moonlight. There was a full moon. Billy got out of bed in the moonlight. He felt spooky and luminous, felt as though he were wrapped in cool fur that was full of static electricity. Now, that's a Don Delillo sentence. Do you remember how White Noise was full of this kind of prose poetic? It's a kind of prose poem set in a future language where the language is imbued with a static electricity of X's. There's so many words in that book that have an X, which is, again, how revelatory is that for now? Think about it. Do you even understand, folks? No, think about that. We've seen Jamie streams on the ubiquity of the X nowadays in terms of even the way people communicate online, right? Or with the Charlie Manson-esque X'd out of society. X marks the spot. You're X'd out. But the X-ray and xenophonic language. He says, he looked down at his bare feet. They were ivory and blue. Billy now shuffled down his upstairs hallway, knowing he was about to be kidnapped by a flying saucer. The hallway was zebra-striped with darkness and moonlight. The moonlight came into the hallway through doorways of the empty rooms of Billy's 2 children. And one thing about this is that ties in with Mother Night is the prevalence of the guy who has a microphone and talks on late night radio to the people in the darkness. And it's kind of revelatory in that sense. I mean, I know this is kind of a, he mentions John Birch Society, and he also predicts Reagan's presidency, by the way, in this. He talks about how he said, there's a car when he goes into a time jump, a kind of quantum leap time jump, and he talks about how there's a bumper sticker that says impeach Earl Warren, sponsored by John Birch Society, and then there's another one that says elect Reagan. But this is like the 60s, and I just find that interesting. Because remember, Reagan was, I know there was an arc, as he says, there was a kind of time arc trajectory of Reagan being picked for that thing in the 80s. But it is still interesting to read about this in the 60s and then have this kind of come true. And the flying saucer thing sort of also plays into that. He doesn't invent the idea of flying saucers, but it's interesting how he sort of predicts people's trying to find meaning in, alien exterior biological entities that are Watcher-like in the sort of Blavatskyan sense. Right. Just because he's rejecting he's rejecting everything that he knows because of what he's been through, I suppose. And there's one part here where he says on page 75, the American flyers turned in their uniforms, became high school kids. He looks at time going backwards. And Hotler turned into a baby. Billy Pilgrim supposed. That wasn't in the movie. Billy was extrapolating. Everybody turned into a baby, and all humanity, without exception, conspired biologically to produce 2 perfect people named Adam and Eve, he supposed. He saw everything backwards. He saw Dresden backwards. He says the formation flew backwards over a German city that was in flames. The bombers opened their bomb bay doors, exerted a miraculous magnetism which shrunk the fires, gathered them into cylindrical steel containers, and lifted the containers into the bellies of the planes. The containers were stored neatly in racks. The Germans below had miraculous devices of their own, which were long steel tubes. They used them to suck more fragments from the crewmen and planes. But there were still a few wounded Americans, though, and some of the bombers were in bad repair over France, though. German fighters came up again, made everything and everybody as good as new. He talks about finding the crystallized elements that they used to put into the bombs. I was looking, I was doing some reading about white phosphorus this week, and you guys ever seen the photos of those bombs? I know probably everybody has, but they reminded me of a couple of things. Okay, maybe this is just a poetic interpretation, but they sort of gave me a view that I hadn't had before on the movie. What's it called? It was originally called An Enemy, but Enemy by Denis Villeneuve. Again, it's weird how there's a. What's the sculpture that the surrealist made? The lady, she was a lady. The sculpture that the lady made of the kind of spider-like glob that octopus-like has tentacles floating over the city in the movie Enemy, the Jake Gyllenhaal movie. And of course, that in the movie ties into the like Eyes Wide Shut, club that the actor is running, which is how he's allowed to have acting is both what he does as a cover in the film, but also his doppelganger. He meets himself in the movie, right? And the self that he meets is a history professor, and the spider glob that floats over the city is supposed to look like what's the name of the surrealist? Somebody in the chat, can you find me that? What's the name of the surrealist sculptor that made those spider globs? It's not Boonwell. It was a lady. Forget her name. But anyway, we did the stream on surrealism, but I didn't mention that one in it. And that also reminds me of, it looks in the movie exactly the way that the white phosphorus looks hovering over the city. And so we get this kind of specter octopus tentacle with its hands involved in everything, plus the glob, phosphoglob, but in black, that is kind of spider-like, putting its spider hands into the Eyes Wide Shut club. Also his life, creating a dissociative doppelganger in the film, right? Splitting his relationships in the movie, functioning as like a visceral evil in the movie. Thank you. Yes, Toledo. Thank you, Toledo. Really appreciate you. It was Louise Bourgeois. Thank you, Toledo. And yes, Kit says, and you said it wasn't Louise. Yeah, it wasn't Louis Boonwell, but it was Louise Bourgeois. But anyway, that reminds me of also Arrival, because that's the way that the alien blob globs look in the film, with their nonlinear time point on the other side of the screen, right? Which is like the other side of Plato's cave inside the Gnostic egg in the film, which of course in the film leads to this kind of globalist oblivion utopia. But it also reminded me of this book, because that's in a way the way the Tralfamadorians remind me of their kind of system and of the way that he sees them, and then that leads him to think about the nature of reality in that sense. That's kind of the viewpoint that he comes to, the kind of conclusion. But the white phosphorus thing is amazing. You guys should look up some of the pictures of it. They always look like that. Shouts out to Maddie in the chat, because Maddie, Digital Minefield, will be here tomorrow night for our True Detective analysis. Let's see. He goes on to, he says, the saucer was 100 feet in diameter with portals around its rim. The light from the portals was pulsing purple. Good alliteration. The only noise it made was the owl song. It came down to hover over Billy and to enclose him in a cylinder of pulsing purple light. Now there was the sound of a seeming kiss as an airtight hatch in the bottom of the saucer was opened. Right, he's going through the tunnels of Typhon as Bob Lazar, the war victim, into the pulsing purple light of the spaceships, talking to the clockwork elf globs. Down snaked a ladder that was outlined in pretty lights like a Ferris wheel. He's climbing a kind of false Jacob's ladder into this thing, right? Billy's will was paralyzed by a zap gun aimed at him from one of the portals. It became imperative that he take hold of the bottom rung of the sinuous ladder, which he did. The rung was electrified so that Billy's hands locked onto it hard. He was hauled into the airlock, and machinery closed the bottom door. Only then did the ladder, wound onto a reel in the airlock, let him go. Only then did Billy's brain start working again. There's another movie where they do this. Remember that movie, Mission to Mars? You guys remember that, where they see the face? They made that movie because they remember, I think it was Buzz Aldrin said that he had seen that face on the surface of Mars. And then they had those like satellite images. They were like, it looks like a face, man. So then they made this movie, and it's got that Van Halen. It's like, dance tonight or whatever. And they're like dancing in space, right? And then they go on to Mars. That movie was a kind of a beta version of Red Planet with Val Kilmer in it. Remember Val Kilmer's movie? Did I cover that one? I taught that movie as part of a class that I taught on film. It's a pretty good movie. That's the first movie with clout goggles. Val Kilmer's wearing clout goggles in the movie. It's really good. I like that movie. It's got a DARPA death bot. Of course, I like any Val Kilmer movie. But anyway, he goes on to be mainlined with morphine. Page 99. Under morphine, Billy had a dream of giraffes in a garden. He's just zooming away. He's zooming away, right? The giraffes were following gravel paths, were pausing to munch sugar pears from treetops. Billy was a giraffe, too. He ate a pear. It was a hard one. It fought back against the grinding teeth. It snapped in juicy protest. Another reference is, he says, now the Englishman came into the hospital to check on Billy. He was an infantry colonel captured at Dunkirk. It was he who had given Billy morphine. There wasn't a real doctor in the compound, so the doctoring was up to him. How's the patient? He asked Darby. Dead to the world, but not actually dead? No. How nice to feel nothing and still get full credit for being alive. Darby now came to lugubrious attention. No, please, as you were, with only 2 men for each officer and all the men sick, I think we can do without the usual pageantry between officers and men. And this, he goes on to talk about, he says, it's a children's crusade. Darby described the incredible artificial weather that Earthlings sometimes create for other Earthlings when they don't want other Earthlings to inhabit Earth anymore. Shells were bursting in the treetops with terrible bangs, he said, showering down knives and needles and razor blades. Interesting that he's talking about Gil Bates machines, but not specifically Gil Bates machines. He's talking about MIC destruction of white phosphorus rain here instead of electrified silver cadmium toxic airborne event Don Delillo events. But it is interesting that these are the watchers. We've been watching you, and we don't like what you're doing, so we're going to take you away and show you the truth, man. But then Billy finds a diamond ring. Let's see. On this page 117, I wrote Dresden, view of humanism from the point of view of watchers, melded with action as satire of humanism, which is postmodernism. And then, of course, there's also another prerequisite is Arabian Nights. Please go back and watch my Arabian Nights if you haven't seen that, because there's a reference here to the Scheherazade, right? Scheherazade telling the story of the Arabian Nights. A great motor yacht named the Scheherazade now slid past the marriage bed. The song its engine sang was a very low organ note. All her lights were on. 2 beautiful people, a young man and a young woman in evening clothes, were at the rail in the stern, loving each other in their dreams in the lake. They were honeymooning, too. They were Lance Rumford of Newport, Rhode Island, and his bride, the former Cynthia Landry, who had been a childhood sweetheart of JFK in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. And let's see. I'm going to skip to page 178. A guard would go to the head of the stairs every so often to see what it was like outside. Then he would come down and whisper to the other guards. There was a firestorm out there. Dresden was one big flame. The one flame ate everything organic, everything that would burn. It wasn't safe to come out of the shelter until noon the next day when the Americans and their guards did come out. The sky was black with smoke. Black rain. The sun was an angry little pinhead. Dresden was like the moon now, nothing but minerals. The stones were hot. Everybody else in the neighborhood was dead. So it goes. Now, that, I think, is one of the strengths of this book, because, again, he is showing us an imagery of the dead Valley of Ashes, wasteland, lunar landscape of Dresden post-firebombing. That would be impossible to understand. It would be impossible for words to understand in a purely historical account. You know, a purely historical, objective, dispassionate account of this event. And I think that the book is really important because it also it continues to open the eyes of a lot of people to the events that occurred. And one thing that I think is interesting about this, again, is the passage with the Germans is great, because the way that he discusses them, let me see if I can find this. The way that he discusses them is both, he mentions, he sort of ties in our understanding of Dresden with Sodom and Gomorrah. First of all, on page 21, he says he looked through the Gideon Bible in my motel room for tales of great destruction. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. I read, then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities and all the plain and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground, so it goes. Those were vile people in both cities. It is well known. The world was better off without them. And Lot's wife, of course, was told not to look back where all those people in their homes had been. But she did look back, and he says, I love her for that because it was so human. So she was turned to a pillar of salt. So it goes. You're putting your humanistic, your postmodern broken humanist feelings into the wrong sensation here. You are looking for light in the wrong place. Okay, with this speaker here. He says, people aren't supposed to look back. I'm certainly not going to do it anymore. I've finished the war book now. The next one I write is going to be fun. This one's a failure and had to be since it was written by a pillar of salt. It begins like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim may come unstuck in time. It ends like this. Pooty wheat. Now, the last words of the story are this is interesting because I was just talking about X and being X'd out. And the last words of the story are a Twitter. The last words of the story are a tweet. Right? Do you realize that? I know you probably do, but the last words of the story are almost literally a predictive tweet here, because what he's saying here is that the absurdist thing about the destruction and the wasteland is that even after the worst events, the birds managed to survive and to speak. Now, he sees that as a kind of absurd statement about what human beings are willing to do to each other, and we need to have faith in other human beings and recognize the dignity of other human beings. But there's no sense of the dignified term. The term dignity doesn't seem to come into it unless you have a faith-based dignity in the fact that God sees human beings, creates human beings infinitely, right? Every second's a creation, and that we are imbued like with there's a holiness in the creation of human beings, right? That we're given a chance to live, and that we did this to each other. And we should find beauty in the sanctity of human life based on what we've been given. And that the birds singing shows that, dawn is another day, that the sun rises, and that God gives us life and light. Right? The light of another day. Instead of the absurdity of the birds. And I understand why he's saying that. I understand the absurdity of hearing the birds, the birds waking up after such a terrible event. It does seem to kind of melt the mind. But it also is predictive of like the tweets after the worst event. That's crazy that it does that, right? And that's why it ends with the kind of absurdist, like, personified onomatopoeia of birds tweeting, like literally birds speaking and chirping after a firestorm. That's crazy. That's crazy how life works, I guess I can summarize. I just found that really interesting. But the part about the Germans was, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it while I'm sitting here, but the part about the Germans was wild because the way he describes them reminded me of Saving Private Ryan, or actually an opposite of Saving Private Ryan, because what he does at the beginning of the book is he mentioned the part where the guy asked him if this is an anti-war book, and he says, I guess. But it is in a way, because when he says that he sees the Germans, and the way he describes them is, we read it and we go, these people are human beings and they're alive. And what they did in Saving Private Ryan, the film, this is my major drawback of the film. And this really comes from Rob Eger's interpretation of this. So shouts out to Rob Eger, who really brought this up to me, is, not to me, but he made a video about it. which I thought was great, and I thought was very truthful, which is that the movie was sold as an anti-war movie, but it's an anti-war movie for Americans. In other words, it doesn't show the dignity of human beings because it tries to show the dignity of our side, but it doesn't show that they're human beings that we're fighting, so it actually cancels out what it's trying to do. Because the way that he says this is basically that when they show the Americans, they're all clearly individuals. They are individualized. They have different hair. They have different, faces, personalities. And we're not expected to go into the personalities of the enemy in a war movie. But the way they're portrayed is as kind of like comic book figures of an enemy, right? Yes, they are all in a war, and yes, they all have, buzz cuts, and they're all in like SS uniforms. But one of the things is that people often can't tell whether the guy who's killed at the end, Mickey Mouse, that guy is the same guy that they let go. And it is to me, it's clearly the same guy. But it's just interesting that when people watch the movie, they're unable to tell the difference between the German character. People think that the guy who does the horrible, the bayonet death in the upstairs of the house, the zoom zoom. Remember the Family Guy episode? They think that guy is the same guy at the end, but when I watch it, I go, it's clearly not. You just look at his face; it's a different guy. It's supposed to be a German, but it's a different guy. But the fact that people can't tell the difference between that shows that the movie fails in that instance, because it's a human killing a human in that movie, right? So that makes it worse if you do that, rather than to sell the movie as an anti-war movie, but not show the truth of that, if that makes sense. So I understand what they were going for, but I just think it's kind of it's a weird drawback of the film. By the way, I know a lot of people think this, so it's not really a new take, but it's interesting that Saving Private Ryan and The Thin Red Line came out at the same time, and that they are so completely different. Like, Thin Red Line is subjective and impressionistic, and is really a movie that appeals to the soul, whereas The Thin Red Line, whereas Saving Private Ryan is a kind of like you're reading a Shirer account of the war. I put that loosely, but a kind of I don't want to say revisionist, but like as a historical document of the war, which is like invested with the kind of like weird attempt at emotion. And I know that it's a good movie. I mean, I like the movie, and I've seen it a million times. I saw it the day it came out. And I'll watch it again. But just that there are two completely different movies. And if you want to see a Thin Red Line analysis, go back and watch. I did an analysis of that movie. Last summer or about a year ago. Anyway. So let's finish up here with Slaughterhouse 5. Let's skip all the way to the lunar. I thought the lunar reference was particularly apt, and also the minerals is interesting because again, the minerals on the moon, on the lunar surface of the pockmarked and dead and burning surface of Dresden is supposed to mirror the mineralized missiles or bombs that are dropping to create the firestorm on Dresden. There's supposed to be a weird mirror imagery of that. And certainly that plays into a kind of Don DeLeo white noise vision of broken postmodernism. So I guess that's the main difference. I guess I'm realizing this in real time. The main difference between modernism and postmodernism in its depictions of war is that one is a valley of ashes and the other is a lunar landscape. I guess that cracks it for me. Right? One seems to be almost otherworldly. The latter is otherworldly, while the former is in the earth. So, at the end of Slaughterhouse 5, here again, this is Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. If you're just tuning in, he says on page 135 or 185, He says, one of the things Rumsford had told Lilly to get in Boston was a copy of President Harry S. Truman's announcement to the world that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima. She had a Xerox of it, very white noise, and Rumsford asked her if she had read it. No, she didn't read well, which was one of the reasons he had dropped out of high school. Now, I know I'm making connections to Cormac McCarthy and Don DeLeo. I'm attempting to do that in terms of postmodern literature, but I still find a huge differentiation amongst them, like I started off saying. This says, here's the speech. So Lilly sat down and pretended to read the Truman thing, which went like this. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It had more than 2,000 times the blast power of the British Grand Slam, which is the largest bomb ever used in the history of warfare. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws the power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. Before 1939, it was the accepted belief of scientists that it was theoretically possible to release atomic energy, but nobody knew any practical method of doing it. By 1942, however, we knew that the Germans were working feverishly to find a way to add atomic energy to all the other engines of war with which they hoped to enslave the world, which is totally canceled out by that book, Hotler's Scientists, which talks about Heisenberg and his statements about the fact that that wasn't necessarily that was part of the psyop that was there, but that's not to say that they didn't think this was occurring, but that is part of that Heisenberg's statement in that book says that Hotler was not interested in that because when he was told that it would engulf the globe in a firestorm, he was uninterested in it. Now, that's what he says in the book. I'll just leave it at that. But they failed. He says, but they failed. We may be grateful to Providence that the Germans got the V1s and V2s late and in limited quantities, and even more grateful that they didn't get the A-bomb. We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have on the ground in any city, said Harry Truman. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare, and so on. And then he talks about the book, The Destruction of Dresden, by an Englishman named David Blank. I'll leave it there. Go see Norm's streams on that particular person and what he says about those things. But what's interesting here is that speech also mimics Churchill's speech, right? We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight them on the beaches. Also, I know that Churchill wanted to do Dresden, pushed his the RAF head to do Dresden because he wanted to demonstrate air superiority and power before the Yalta Conference. But it says Air Marshal Sir Robert Sonby, KCB, KBE, etc. I find it difficult to understand Englishmen or Americans who weep about enemy civilians who were killed, but who have not shed a tear for our gallant crews lost in combat with a cruel enemy. I find it would have been well for Mr. X to have remembered when he was drawing the frightful picture of the civilians killed at Dresden that V1s and V2s were at the very time falling on England, killing civilian men, women, and children indiscriminately. And I thought maybe this was the reason why those lawsuits may have been allowed to have been proceeded against that particular author, or at least one of the reasons, because of his work and his statements about Dresden and about about what he said were the actual numbers. The V1s and V2s were at the very time falling on England, and I just found that interesting. I also found this interesting because, I mean, he mentions they would do well to read this book and ponder the fate of Dresden, where 135,000 people, he said, died as the result of an air attack with conventional weapons. high explosive bombs in Hiroshima killed 71,000. I mean, Anyway, so my point is that, yeah, Kit, that this also ties into one of the other great, monumental postmodern works, which is Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, because it's about V1s and V2s, of course, and the sort of lunar landscape of postmodernity. If you would like me to cover that, if you want me to cover Gravity's Rainbow, I'll do it. But somebody's going to have to, if you want to sponsor that stream, it would have to be a it would have to be a sponsor stream, because the book is it's too thick and too complex for me to devote to it, at least anytime soon. But if you want to see that, I will do it. Or just say you want me to cover it, and I'll cover that. If you're interested, if you want me to cover Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, just let me know in the comments afterwards. I need to cover it anyway. Yeah, he talks about he's got a cruel doctor who diagnoses him with echolalia, a mental disease which makes people immediately repeat things that, people around them say. And then he mentions shock treatments in here. So one of the things about the electricity reminds me of the stream that I did with Jay on Return to Oz, which is oftentimes in these works with dissociation, we get lightning, firestorms, and electricity functioning as outer symbols of what's going on in the parallel world through dissociation because of electroshock therapy. So when he is climbing the ladder and he feels the electricity taking him into the ladder from the hospital room, is he being electroshocked? Is a figurative interpretation of that. And then the book ends with the framed chapter 10 here about Robert Kennedy, about RFK, whose summer house is 8 miles from the house I live in all year round. Was that event happened, and it says he died last night. MLK was shot a month ago. He died too. So it goes. And every day my government gives me a count of corpses created by military science in Vietnam, which is psychotronic warfare and Phoenix program. So it goes. He then goes on to talk about the population of the world and 7 billion before the year 2000. I suppose they will all want dignity, said O'Hare. There were, on page 213, there were barricades on the main roads leading into the ruins. Now he's gone back to Dresden. Germans were stopped there. They were not permitted to explore the moon. So it's, again, literal, almost literal in a sense, I suppose. Not truly literal. It's still metaphorical, but it becomes, again, a lunar landscape. Prisoners of war from the many lands came together that morning at such a place in Dresden. It had been decreed that here was where the digging for bodies was to begin. So the digging began. Billy found himself paired as a digger with a Maori who had been captured at Tobruk. That Maori was chocolate brown. He had whirlpools tattooed on his forehead and his cheeks. Interesting, the whirlpools. We're going to discuss that tomorrow night when we talk about True Detective. But also that brings to mind the widening gyre. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, right? He had whirlpools tattooed on his forehead and cheeks. Billy and the Maori dug into the inert, uncompromising gravel of the moon. The materials were loose, so there were constant little avalanches. Many holes were dug at once. Nobody knew yet what there was to find. Most holes came to nothing, to pavement, or to boulders so huge they would not move. There was no machinery. Not even horses or mules or oxen could cross the moonscape. And Billy and the Maori and others helping them with their particular hole came at last to a membrane of timbers laced over rocks which had wedged together to form an accidental dome. They made a hole in the membrane like they're digging into the Parthenon. Remember he talked about the poet of the Parthenon? Now he's digging into a kind of inverted Parthenon here. And then he says there was darkness and space under there. Interesting, because instead of outer space, now he's into an inner space. Yeah, kid, exactly. A German soldier with a flashlight went down into the darkness, was gone a long time. When he finally came back, he told a superior on the rim of the hole that there were dozens of bodies down there. They were sitting on benches. They were unmarked. So it goes. The superior said that the opening in the membrane should be enlarged and that a ladder should be put in the hole so that the bodies could be carried out. Thus began the first corpse mine in Dresden. One of the other things there's two phrases in this that really stuck with me also. One was corpse mine and the other was blood gutter. Because he talks about how the guy, I forget his name, but the guy that he comes across that's his war buddy, who is the psychopath in the book, his dad was a collector of Trotcher instruments, and one of those was the Iron Maiden, and he pointed out the blood gutter in the floor. And the blood gutter gets mimicked and mirrored here by the corpse mine. There were hundreds of corpse mines operating by and by. They didn't smell bad at first. They were wax museums. But then the bodies rotted and liquefied, and the stink was like roses and mustard gas. So it goes. The Maori Billy had worked with died of the dry heaves after having been ordered to go down in that stink and work. He tore himself to pieces, throwing up and throwing up. So it goes. So a new technique was devised. Bodies weren't brought up anymore. They were cremated by soldiers with flamethrowers right where they were. The soldiers stood outside the shelters, simply sent the fire in. Do you understand the irony of what he's saying here? That their enemy had firestormed the city, and then the only way to collect the corpses is to flamethrow them. Somewhere in there, the poor old high school teacher, Edgar Darby, was caught with a teapot he had taken from the catacombs. He was arrested for plundering. He was tried and shot. So it goes. And somewhere in there was springtime. The corpse mines were closed down. The soldiers all left to fight the Russians. In the suburbs, the women and children dug rifle pits. And then one morning they got up to discover that the door was unlocked. World War II in Europe was over. Billy and the rest wandered out onto the shady street. The trees were leafing out. There was nothing going on out there, no traffic of any kind. There was only one vehicle, an abandoned wagon drawn by two horses. The wagon was green and coffin-shaped because he rode in a I remember earlier he rode in a coffin in the back of this horse carriage. Birds were talking, and one bird said to Billy Pilgrim, "Puduweet." And that's it. So I wrote Twitter, postmodern, broken fragment, and landscape, valley of ashes, wasteland, time and space, all mixed up. And of course, the clockwork elves, globular blob, Blavatsky watcher, fake and grays with their labyrinth hands with an all-seeing eye in the middle. And that's it. That is Slaughterhouse 5. Okay, so just briefly, let's talk about Mother Night. And I wanted to get this, so I didn't get a chance to get the book. And I haven't read Mother Night. I've just read I've read this in Cat's Cradle. But Mother Night is interesting, and I'm going to talk about it because oftentimes, the film versions of books don't do them justice. We've talked about this many times, but one thing Vonnegut, and I don't mean to go by what the author says, right? I don't want to contradict my own statements, but no, he said in his description of Mother Night that it's the most faithful rendering of his book, even though he doesn't seem to care very much. But he's also in the movie. Vonnegut himself is in the movie, and so one thing that happens in Mother Night. So here's what Mother Night is about. Basically, a guy is born in America. A kid is born. His father works for General Electric, and eventually he gets a job overseas in Berlin. So he moves there as a child. Then he starts. He learns the German language, and he becomes a playwright, much like in The Lives of Others. Remember that? Great film about East Germany and the Stasi. But he becomes a playwright, and then he falls in love with a woman. And then one day he's sitting on a bench, and he's approached by a guy who's speaking English in an American. It's an American. And in the movie, Nick Nolte plays the guy. And, of course, the movie, again, is framed because he starts off in Israeli prison. and we just have to learn how he got there. And then we see him, we see all these events unfold, and he's sitting on the park bench in Berlin, and he's approached by John Goodman. And John Goodman is great in this movie, and this is a really fascinating view into espionage that is pretty unique in terms of fiction. And John Goodman basically approaches him and says, "Hey, how you doing, buddy?" And he says, "Look, I'm going to present you with an opportunity because I know all about you and I've seen all your plays." And Nick Nolte's like, "What?" And he says, "You know that war is going to start here very soon, and you have a choice, and you have a day to make the choice. And the choice is you can either come back to America or you can serve your country by working for us. But if you work for us," he says, "nobody will ever know your name. Nobody will ever know you worked for us, and we'll deny all responsibility, but you're going to do a service to us. And I can't promise you any rewards." Now, this is pretty truthful in terms of what Bill Donovan says in I got a biography of Bill Donovan up there. What Bill Donovan said, and also in The Devil's Chessboard, Alan Dulles, and in some of the declassified CIA docs about approaching possible assets and agents, which is that they appeal to their sense of one thing immediately is to appeal to their sense of patriotism, so do it for your country. Another one is appeal to their sense of greed, pay them, and then another is compromise. Right. And all three of these sort of work in a symbiotic relationship. But what he says here is, "I'll contact you tomorrow, I'll find you." And so Nick Nolte in the film does this, and he at Hill 364 in Londoc. So he does this. He decides to do this, but he doesn't tell his wife, and he keeps this all a secret. And he becomes essentially a kind of talk radio Rush Limbaugh, Goebbels character, all mixed into one, who is interestingly broadcasting from occupied, from Germany, and he against the United States, and he's an American. And this is obviously great propaganda for the Germans. And this reminded me of Ezra Pound, right? Because, and this may have, there's no way to know whether this is true or not. I don't know of any evidence for this, but Ezra Pound, remember, was imprisoned by the invading American army at the end of World War II in Rapallo in Italy for broadcasting anti-Roosevelt and anti-F reserve statements that were in favor of the Duce. And he was put in a cage, and he was prosecuted as a prisoner of war. He wasn't executed for treason, but when he came back to America, he took a 10-year vow of silence. And so what James McLaughlin and some of these guys with New Directions were involved in Mockingbird, and were funded by CIA fronts. So I wonder if this is a weird version of a story that is parallel with Ezra Pound. If there's any truth of this dealing with Ezra Pound, was Ezra Pound doing the same thing? I don't know. Maybe he was being totally genuine and sincere, which is also likely. But it would be weird if somehow that did turn out to be the case, that he's functioning as this sort of same kind of character as the guy in Mother Night. And I know that, so I know that Vonnegut got the story from a spy master that he met on Cape Cod, which, sounds like a Colby-esque character or somebody. Well, I'm sure it wasn't Colby, but who talks about that these events happen. And what we learn is that when he makes the broadcasts, this was really clever in the movie. I like this because this was an insight into espionage that I hadn't seen. When he makes the broadcast, he marks his paper and his speech according to what somebody else in the editing room has given him, and he doesn't know who the other spy is, but there is another spy there that he knows is working with him, but he can't ever know his identity. And he marks the paper with specific codes for like when to cough, when to breathe, and when to make certain noises that sound like part of his speech, like and now I'm talking. But this ends up being a cryptographic code. And so later he finds out that his wife has died. And then when he finally comes into contact with his handler again, who's John Goodman says, I know your wife died. I knew a week before you. In fact, that was one of the messages that you broadcast to me. And he says, I broadcast that about my wife and I didn't even know it. Because his wife is working for like a German USO and gets bombed by the Russians. And his wife, by the way, is played by who else? Cheryl Lee. We just did Twin Peaks, and I just went on this whole rant about how awesome Cheryl Lee is. And I'm going to read you a review of this film that came out at the time that talks about Cheryl Lee. What do these people have against Cheryl Lee? Is it because of her role in Twin Peaks and they didn't like that she did this revelatory thing in it? Is that why they hate her so much? I just can't understand it. She's great in the film. I think she's perfect. And I'm not saying that because I like Cheryl Lee. I'm saying it because it really is great in the film. She plays dual roles. So Kirsten Dunst plays Cheryl Lee's little sister. And she has this weird conversation with Nick Nolte, and they're gonna leave and they're gonna depart, and her Cheryl Lee / Kirsten Dunst's dad is the head of the Kripo or the Gestapo or the Kripo, Kripo, in Berlin, I think. And he even says to Nick Nolte after she's dead, he says, I never approved of my daughter marrying you. I wanted her to marry a Prussian officer, but that didn't happen. And what's funny is that I thought you were a spy for all this time, but even if you were, what you said convinced me in the justification of their cause. Which is a strange, that's one of the strange ironies in this, right? And that's probably the truth of, we know that's one of the truths of psyops and, fake flags and espionage is that they end up working both ways, right? So anyway, they leave, and then Nick Nolte eventually the war's over and he gets back to America, and he was this famous broadcaster, but he's living in New York. And so his downstairs neighbors, the lady kind of recognizes him and he says, no, that wasn't me. That was somebody else. And then he makes friends with this artist who lives in the building. And then eventually an anonymous letter is sent to some John Birch types. And he's approached by some kind of American sympathizing paperclip people who say, "Oh, you're our hero," and they start introducing him to these meetings. And it's crazy because he didn't believe in this in the first place, and now he does, but he doesn't. And he talks in the film, and I'm sure in the book, about how they are a nation of two. He and his wife, how they were a nation of two. So regardless of the two nations, they're a nation of two because they're one's American, one's German, but they're unified in marriage, and how he loved her. And so all of the political stuff is just kind of. It's just exterior, and he just finds himself in this mode, which is a very postmodern thing, even though this is World War II, but the book is a postmodern view of the way that these people don't believe in anything, right? And then they say they have a surprise for him, and they bring him his wife. And he can't believe she's alive, but it turns out that it's not his wife. It's his wife's little sister who's now grown up. She was captured by the Russians, and she, of course, has been turned. She's a Russian agent. John Goodman shows up out of retirement, right? Because he's been ordered to go there and say that, look, there's communiques that are happening, and your name's on them. And so we need to figure this out. And what's interesting is he says there's only 3 people that are even going to know that you're a spy. And he says that's probably too much. One is him. The other is Wild Bill Donovan, OSS. And the other is Roosevelt. And he says Roosevelt listened to his broadcasts all the time and got a kick out of them. But what happens is he learns that the guy he's friends with, the artist, is also a Russian agent who just happened to be there. And this was infiltrating American systems after the war, spying on various things in New York, and just happened to come across him. So then Nick Nolte goes back in and he confronts the two of them and says, hey, I'm not going to go to Mexico City for vacation, because he knew he would be put on a plane in a neutral territory and then flown out to Moscow for trial and paraded as an example of an American spy that they've caught, who is working a paperclip operation a la Klaus Barbie, worked for the American government and for that group, and he would be paraded as such. So then he confronts his girlfriend, who he thought was his wife, but is now, he learns is his wife's sister, and she tries to do a double fake Jeff Stein McEffrey, and she bites down on some cyanide. He doesn't, and then he's got a gun pulled on him by the Popov or whatever, who's the Russian agent, and then he eventually, he goes downstairs, talks to his neighbors, and says he wants to turn himself in for trial and be shipped back to that place in the Middle East. So he goes there, and he turns himself in, and then he writes his memoirs. So his memoirs function as a meta-narrative. And then at the very end of the novel, this reminded me of, what's that Lars von Trier movie with, somebody in the chat tell me, what's that Lars von Trier movie with Bjork? It's one of the darkest movies I've ever seen. It's something about dance, not Dance of Death, which is interesting because Slaughterhouse 5 brings up the subtitle of Slaughterhouse 5, right, is The Children's Crusade: A Duty Dance with Death. And also, I forgot to mention that it also functions as a kind of postmodern anti-inverted Pilgrim's Progress, because this is the title page, right? But and because of his everyman pilgrim aspect, but into the inverse, right? And so the Children's Crusade, we talked about the Children's Crusade with the Outremer stream and the Crusades. Yes, Dancer in the Dark. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, KF, Kevin. Thank you, Living the Dream. Yes, Dancer in the Dark. Cause name Dancer in the Dark. Thank you. Very, very dark movie. And so. What was I saying? So he turns himself in, and just like Dancer in the Dark, the same thing, he gets Jeff Stein McEffrey at the end of the movie, but he does it to himself. So he does a reverse fake double switcheroo Jeff Stein McEffrey, even though John Goodman writes him a letter and says, I'm coming out of retirement and I will put my thing on the line and I'll say that you were doing this for us. But at this point, he is intent on his weird humanistic pilgrimage of nothingness that he has put himself into, even though he did this thing, and now he can't tell what's virtue and what's vice, what's right and what's wrong, and it ends in death in a prison cell. And so that's Mother Night. But before that, there's a scene where he's in New York and he's standing there and he can't move. This is a pretty great scene. This is a great scene that I didn't expect from Vonnegut in this sense, but even though Vonnegut appears as man on the street in the film, and he's literally walking towards him, and he has a look on his face where it's a scene of total static immobility. He cannot move. He can't even move because his wife is gone, his wife's sister is gone, his friend has turned. He fought for nothing, even though he didn't really fight. And what he was psyoping against came true, but then didn't. And so it's just full of contradictions and brokenness, and we end with total misery and nothingness. And I think that it's important to read and view such things. I mean, I think Mother Night is a well-done film. Overlooked. I remember when it came out in like 1996. But I think these things are important to view because they provide a kind of an insight into a particular paradigm in which we can see that the status quo finds itself, if that makes sense. So last thing I'll read here is I had this essay to read on Vonnegut. I forgot to mention also the talk of Dostoevsky in Slaughterhouse 5. And then this writer calls Vonnegut a kind of pop fiction, which is probably a great term for it, for his kind of fringe in the middle between popular acceptance and a kind of critical view of Kurt Vonnegut. But I would go with Harold Bloom's analysis of Vonnegut that I mentioned at the beginning of the stream. And mixed in with my own. But here's what this is a Los Angeles Times review of Mother Night from the time. They always get it wrong. They always get it wrong especially with Cheryl Lee. So it says, late in Keith Gordon's faithful, if occasionally awkward adaptation of Kurt Vonnegut's 1961 novel Mother Night, Vonnegut himself appears as an extra in a scene in post-World War II Greenwich Village. Was he in Greenwich Village in that scene? I don't remember him being in Greenwich. Maybe he was, but it is a West Village. It's a wordless cameo lasting maybe 2 seconds, but Gordon uses the moment in a way that does the author proud, I suppose. Vonnegut is just one of many people seen walking around the story's hero, Howard W. Campbell, and an infamous one-time radio propagandist who is standing frozen in the middle of a sidewalk. Campbell's off-camera voice explains that he stopped because he can think of no reason to go on, and Vonnegut in close-up looks at him with a combination of sadness and contempt, as if he were commenting directly on what we, the audience, have seen up to that point. It's been a favorite trick of Vonnegut to interact as the author with the characters he creates, and viewers who don't recognize him or that literary mannerism will be puzzled by the scene. No, they won't. Everybody recognizes Kurt Vonnegut. You would know him right away when you see him. And one of the reasons for this is that he draws cartoons of his own face in his books. That's one of the things that annoys me. I'll say this. That annoys me about Vonnegut. I see this as a kind of National Lampoon, like a sincere, absurdist National Lampoon vision of his own prose. And I don't like the cartoon drawing. I think it both detracts from the work, but also somehow symbolizes his work, which I see as a negative. And I get that his books are cartoony because of the absurdity, especially with Cat's Cradle. I mean, there's a lot of kind of absurd cartoon depiction in Cat's Cradle, and here's Cat's Cradle right here, but right there, cover that. But and I see why he's doing it, right? Because he's saying it's absurd. It's like in the movies when the people go insane and they're always watching Looney Tunes. So it's like we're watching the Looney Tunes version of the world without the lightness or the humor. And I don't mean that in totality. I just mean I find that as a drawback for his prose. And so we know what he looks like because of his cartoon visions of himself, right? But that plays into the unreliable narrator aspect of his work and how he's constantly sort of commenting on characters as if he's part of it. I understand that. This is like what what's that artist, Ralph Steadman did with Hunter S. Thompson. But the point of Hunter S. Thompson's work, we've covered Thompson and Generation of Swine and all that, it is so cartoonish and absurd. We also covered some of the dark aspects, but it's so cartoonish and absurd that it becomes a kind of okay. All right, let me put it this way. So, of all people, Norm did this really well in words in his Not a Memoir, because he takes Hunter S. Thompson again to its kind of apotheosis in a pure humorous sense where we don't know the difference between reality and fiction, but it's all true. With Hunter S. Thompson, we sort of have that, and we have these nightmarish sort of ayahuasca yage visions of the world, like literally in cartoons, mixed in with the kind of Jackson Pollock-esque modern art and postmodern literary art, where time is a big glob and life seems connected but also connectedless. So I don't like the cartoons. I can see why people do like them. I do see that. I see that it kind of works in that sense. But I just find that a kind of a drawback. Right? He says, and I'm not trying to be stuffy or something, or like elitist. I don't think it's, I'm not trying to be pedantic in details. I don't know. I just don't find it make. I just don't find it supports the work in that sense. But then again, maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the point of it. That it's a kind of nightmare cartoon world where we seemed like to have the anodyne of the cartoons, but and that distracts us from the nightmare vision of the hellscape, the hellish lunar moonscape of Dresden, for example. Does that make sense to you guys? Anyway, he says, this reviewer says, Los Angeles Times, 1996, and it's much more than homage. Vonnegut's look freezes Campbell in another way. Here's a man who, as a young American playwright, was living in Germany in the late 30s and is recruited as a spy. He becomes the Tokyo Rose of the third of that thing. The voice of a passionate anti-thing, mocking the Allies while reaffirming. I want to read this. It's so fucking annoying. I can't even read this thing because of the word. You know what I'm saying? Fuck. Excuse my language, folks. The affiliates will not be happy with that. I promise I won't do it again. All the time passing along coded messages edited into his copy to the American command. 15 years later, after the war, he's living in a rundown Greenwich Village apartment, an icon of these people being pursued for different reasons by both of these intel agencies, and unable to prove his true role in the war because, as he was forewarned, the U.S. government will never acknowledge it. And then what we pretend to be, Vonnegut writes in the first paragraph of his novel, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be. Because eventually, he goes on to say, we become what we pretend to be. As Campbell stands stiff as a stone in Greenwich Village, Vonnegut's look suggests that the moral has become fact. The apolitical Campbell, who had accepted the spy role more as an acting challenge than a call to patriotism, is stunned all these years later by the insight that he may have done far more harm than good. Mother Night is a dark and disturbing tale unrelieved by any offhand humor for Vonnegut's prose, and Gordon, the director, with a script by the television veteran Robert Wide, has made no compromises. Okay. The young director has, however, made some mistakes. Listen to this. Among them, the casting of Cheryl Lee, Twin Peaks' Laura Palmer, as Campbell's German wife, Helga Noth. Lee's accent sounds like a schoolgirl's impression, and she never quite fits the charismatic description Campbell gives of her, and is sticking to the book's flashback structure, with Campbell narrating his memoirs from a prison where he is awaiting his war crimes trial. Gordon draws too direct a line between himself as storyteller and Vonnegut. Different media, different problems, different talents. Okay, you know what? Shut the fuck up. Cheryl Lee is great. Okay? And I just think, I get your point, but I just think they've got a problem with Cheryl Lee playing Laura Palmer. I think they've got a problem with the Laura Palmer character altogether because she's because of what she goes through. They don't like that. Not that they don't like the thing that happened to her. They don't like that it's exposed in the movie. So she is amazing in Twin Peaks, obviously. Now, this isn't a comment on Twin Peaks, but Cheryl Lee, to me, is a rare example of an actress put her in a movie and she's going to do it. She's fucking great, dude. She's amazing, and she's really great in this movie. She's great. She's playing dual roles, and she's great. She's almost too visceral. She's almost too real for the movie. She's hyper real. Cheryl Lee is fucking great. Not only in this, but obviously as Laura. Obviously, I've already mentioned how Cheryl Lee's Laura Palmer is one of the top female performances of all time in film. So that alone, to me, and I know it's a different role, different movie, but that alone, I give her credit. So don't come for Cheryl Lee. Okay? I mean, come on. But besides, who else are you going to get? Who else are you going to get to do this? She's great. You believe her. You believe her in the movie, in this movie. I believe her. I believe her as both characters. Even though I'm watching it, I'm going, oh, wait, this is Kirsten Dunst grown up? I immediately forget that, and I go, okay, I believe it. So I think she's great. I think they just have a problem. I just think they don't like that. I just think that they don't like that that's what the character was in Twin Peaks, and they're never going to forgive her for that. right? Because she portrayed it too accurately. She's too truthful in the movie, right? They don't like that. That was they don't. I mean, I don't like that. That's a thing. But what I'm saying is Cheryl Lee is the exposing truth of Twin Peaks, right? Because we believe her. That's why she's in the. That's why she is the character. So all the rest of them can, I don't know. They just fuck off. I don't know. That's how I feel about that. I don't know about her. I don't know about her as a person. I don't know about her. I don't know what she does as a person. I just know her work, and I like that. I like that I don't know anything about her as a outside of her movie roles. Right, that's somebody really practicing their craft, as they say. Right, that's real to me. That I respect that. I don't know anything about her. I'm sure maybe I just haven't looked into it, but whatever. I don't know, man. But anyway, yeah, a couple of strong supporting performances come from John Goodman as the American intelligence agent, whom Campbell refers to as his blue fairy godmother, and Alan Arkin, playing Campbell's Greenwich Village friend and neighbor George Kraft, who has a dark past of his own. He's the pop-off guy. So anyway, so that's Kurt Vonnegut. That's the Kurt Vonnegut stream. You guys, thank you again to Dr. Head out there for doing a sponsored stream on that. Really appreciate you. Thank you for supporting me in that way, and I'm glad we did this. I'm glad you brought it up and brought it to mind. Coming up, we got another sponsored stream for Coriolanus, William Shakespeare, so I'll be doing this and how it applies to now, how it's revelatory, and how it's a more truthful depiction of the problems of the tragic hero who actually is tragic not because of his tragic flaw, it's because of his virtue in the film. I mean, in the play, in Shakespeare's play. So we'll be doing that coming up soon. Let's see if we got any super chats here, any support. Let's see. Okay, so thank you all for being here. Please make sure that you like and share. And let's get some super chats in here. First of all, shouts out to Darth Moda, who drops $10 and says, I could smell it in the psychos. This town reminds me of somebody's dream of a town. Remember, Jace? Y'all talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Y'all talking about Dungeons and Dragons. We liked you in Reign of Fire. You talking about Dungeons and Dragons? My daddy was a dungeon master for the whole town. Had a pair of 50-sided dice. That's one of the classics. Shouts out to Darth Mono who drops that $10. He can smell something in the psychosphere. Tastes like metal on your tongue. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Let's see. Shouts out to I'm not sure if you want me to say your name, so I'm not gonna DOX you. I'm gonna say shouts out to AD out there who drops $10 on Cash App and says, thank you, Bazed. Hey, thank you, AD. Really appreciate you. That's very kind of you. You are so sweet to Oh, and I got to give a big shout out to. Biggest shout out is to my little sis. Happy birthday, little sis. I love you out there. You are the best sister in the whole world. You are my special friend, and you are a special being. I love you so much. You are the best sister. Nobody could ever be better. So thank you for thank you for having a birthday. No, shouts out to my little sister out there. I love you so much. Happy birthday. And shouts out to Ursat's Aaron, who drops $10 and says, Kurt Vonnegut has a recurring narrator character, Kilgore Trout, that often breaks the fourth wall. Billy Pilgrim meets KV in the camp. Great stream, man. Thanks much. Yes, I forgot to mention Kilgore Trout. Thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for that super chat, because Kilgore Trout obviously reminds me of Bill Kilgore, right? You want to wait around here for 6 hours? We can pick that boat up and put it anywhere you like, young captain. I don't know, sir. That place is kind of hairy. Harry, what do you mean hairy? I mean, it's hairy. It's Charlie's point. Ha ha! Ha ha! You want to wait around here for 6 hours? Someday this war is going to end. And also, that did seriously remind me of Kilgore Trout, reminds me of another work in this kind of which is Richard Brautigan's Trout Fishing in America, which I read in 1998, which weirdly ties into Vonnegut. I'm still trying to process how that ties in. But at the time, I remember in 1998 reading John Barth, Floating Opera. John Barth is the one that Susan Sontag wrote the essay about jouissance, which was part of my, was that college? I think that was at university. I was at university in Belfast, and I did a paper. I took a class on 7 American poets, and I wrote a paper on jouissance in Theodore Rothke, Sylvia Plath, and Ginsberg, I think. My professor, this guy Michael Allen, rest in peace. I think he passed away. Michael Allen said, "Have you ever heard of jouissance? Have you read Susan Sontag's essay?" I think it was Susan Sontag, yeah. And so I read. Was it Susan Sontag? I think it's Sontag. If I'm wrong, I think it was Sontag. It wasn't Camille Paglia. I think it was Sontag. Anyway, but I read the essay on jouissance, and why am I talking about that? Because in 1998 I was reading, I think Rothke or someone, and then I read John Barth's Floating. Because she wrote the essay about John Barth, right? With jouissance, and I read a Floating Opera, and then Richard Brautigan's. Somehow that led to Richard Brautigan's Trout Fishing in America, which is another sort of an American work set in the postmodern period about trout fishing, but as a parallel view of the world. I don't know. It's been however many years since the 26 years since then. So it's been a while since I read that. It might have been 25 years. I might have read it in 99. But anyway, but Kilgore Trout made me think of that. And so thank you for dropping that super chat. Really appreciate you there. And also, shouts out to Jason, who dropped $10 last night. Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate you. I think, let me look and see if we got any other super chats. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try not to close this. Yeah, okay, here we go. Let's see, because I might have missed a super chat in there. And while this is coming up, again, don't forget that tomorrow night you can join Maddie and I, Digital Minefield, Real Cuda Brown here, for our discussion analysis of True Detective Season 4. Definitely episodes 1 through 3. I didn't get to 4 today, so I'm going to try and get to that tomorrow. Tomorrow, as Norm says, tomorrow. Shouts out to let's see, Edward III, Ersatz, Aaron, we got those. And I think that's it for the super chats. And then let's do one more thing here. I want to check and see if we've made any progress here towards our party. Because coming up this weekend, yeah, you guys, help me out, please. Share this, get people to sub. I am 5 away. Listen, man, we're gonna have our big party next weekend. Okay, we're gonna have this is pretty cool how this has worked out. 2-year anniversary of the channel. 3,000 subs. I'm 5 away. I'm 5 away from 3K, and I have made that because of you. This has been a wonderful journey. And every single person who subscribes, it counts. So it's like one at a time. I mean, we're really, slow and steady wins the race here, as they say, I guess. But every single person, we go through every single one, right? We're small here, and that's cool. We do it live. We always do it live, right? But I'm 5 away from that 3,000, that 3K subs. And also, We are at about, I think, we're like 75,000 watch hours or something like that. I'm sharing the analytics with you if you care. But we're also going to hit 200,000 views. We're going to hit 200,000 views. So we'll hit 200,000 views, 3K subs, 2 years, all at the same time. Right? That's pretty cool. And, again, you can get a membership. I've been trying to put in my time here with member streams. We're at $2,995. Trying to put in my time with member streams, and I'll be doing a lot of stuff. I need to be doing some more literature on the member streams because we've been doing movies and hangouts, and that's fun, and I think that's cool. Let me know what you want to see, what you want me to cover. I've been getting a lot of great recommendations in the comments afterwards. But we're going to have some friends, some special beings, some special friends, our friends who have helped us, over these past 2 years are going to stop by next weekend. And again, I want to cover Predator. I want to cover Point Break. It's only just begun, right? To live white lace and promises. A kiss for luck and we're on our way, right? R.I.P. to Chubbs, Dylan, Action Jackson, Apollo Creed, right? Carl Weathers. Rest in peace. There is no tomorrow, Rock. There is no tomorrow. It's funny how that speech is so inspirational, and there's both, he says there's no tomorrow because do it now. Do it. Do it. Right? Remember that? But also, tomorrow is another day. Right? There's always dawn, right? So, yes. So, let me know what you want to see again. We got a bunch of stuff coming up, and thank you guys for being here so much. Shouts out to our friend iPack Arts out there, who is making his way with his great. Oh, now we're 3 away. We're 3 away, you guys. We're 3 subs away. We're at 2,997. We're 3 away. Y'all, help me get out there. Help me get to 3K. Grab a membership. You can support me anytime. Support me with sponsor streams through PayPal, Cash App, Venmo. That gets to me right away. You can super chat anytime. I will see it. I will read your comments. Thank you so much, everybody who supported me. We've had so much support, and you guys rule. I love you. I love all y'all. And let me just check this activity real quick because I know I missed one here. Yeah, shouts out to Jason there. Oh yeah, shouts out to Deborah who dropped $10 on PayPal. Really appreciate that. I think that was after the last stream. Shouts out to NP who dropped. Oh yeah, that was $50. Thank you for that one. And Circle G. Yeah, we got Circle G last time. Thank you so much, Circle G. Everybody out there. So please help me to get there. Follow me on Instagram. Follow our friends. And big shout out to Rooks also, who just dropped his new track. You guys, make sure you support Rooks G on, on the big things. You can buy his music on Bandcamp. You can get him on Spotify, on Apple Music. We love Rooks, and I thank him so much for letting us use his music. And that's going to be great because we just did, we just talked about Ice 9 with Cat's Cradle, and then we're about to talk about more Ice and Tundra with True Detective. So shouts out to Rooks for his new song, Ice Glide. Reach out to him on Instagram. Tell him who sent you. And I think that about does it, you guys. We will be back tomorrow night and hopefully celebrating that 3K, but we're going to do our big party next weekend. And, that's about it. Was it worth it? Yeah, if you're strong enough. Right? You got to keep on. LIVIN. It's tough out there. It's tough out there for all of us, for everybody. It's tough out there for a lot of people. And so I appreciate y'all being here. We got to have love. 2024 got to be the year of love. Got to be somewhere. Right? So, I'm going to play us out. To play us out, here's Sting and cut off his new album. Is anybody getting tired of me doing that? Probably. But I don't care because that's our Do It Live. We do it live here. We do it live. Shouts out to Toledo out there, Ersatz, Kit, Leaves of Grass, Darth, Jethro, Jason, Maddie, Shouts out to our friend Jerry, Exposing Powerful Lives. All of our friends out there. So we do it live. Let's do it live. Here we go. Here's Ice Glide by Rooks to play us out. Here we go. We do it live. We do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live. Fucking thing sucks. Let's go. Shouts out to beautiful Claire from Canada out there. Beautiful Claire. Shouts out to Tech More Graphics, our friend Nixky. Shouts out to Maddie, Digital Mind, Joe Round. Shouts out to Rachel Wilson, Jay Dyer, Jamie Henshaw, Jamie Dyer. Shouts out to the Dyer. Shouts out to David Patrick Harry, Church of the Eternal Logos. Shouts out to Primal Edge Health, Tristan. Shouts out to Jim Bob and Chase. Everybody out there who's helped us along the way. We do it live. We do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it. Do it live. Fucking thing sucks. Heard Vonnegut. Here we go, let's go. Come on. Let's go. Let's go. Yo! That's so good. Shout out to Run. Alright, y'all. Peace. I'll see you tomorrow night. Peace.